The winter of 1412 descended upon the English countryside with a cruelty that even the oldest villagers could not recall. Snow fell in relentless curtains across the lands of Ashford Manor, burying the roads beneath drifts that rose to a man's waist, silencing the world until nothing remained but the howl of wind through bare branches and the distant, mournful cry of wolves in the forest beyond. The sky hung low and gray, pressing down upon the earth like a shroud, and in the village that huddled at the foot of the great estate, mothers gathered their children close and whispered prayers to saints whose names they barely remembered. Within the stone walls of the manor's stable, a young man named Thomas Hale pressed his shoulder against the heavy oak door, forcing it shut against the gale that sought entry with frozen fingers. He was 23 years of age, though the weariness in his dark eyes spoke of a lifetime already spent in service and survival. His hands were rough from labor, his knuckles scarred from the countless small wounds that came with tending horses and mending harnesses, and his clothes were worn thin in places where the cold crept through like water through cracked stone. He owned nothing of value save the strength in his back and the gentleness in his hands when he worked with the animals, and these gifts had earned him a place in the Ashford stables since his 14th year, when plague had taken his mother and left him orphaned in a world that cared little for the fate of peasant boys. The stable was warm with the breath of horses, the air thick with the scent of hay and leather, and the earthy musk of animals huddled against the storm. Thomas moved between the stalls with practiced ease, speaking softly to each horse as he checked their water and adjusted their blankets, his voice a low murmur that seemed to calm them, even as the wind shrieked outside. There were 12 horses in his care, each one worth more than he would earn in a lifetime, and he treated them with a tenderness that he had never been permitted to show another living soul. He paused before the stall of a black destrier named Phantom, the favorite mount of Lord Ashford himself, and rested his forehead against the horse's neck, breathing in the familiar warmth. Phantom nickered softly and pressed his muzzle against Thomas's shoulder, and for a moment, the young stable hand allowed himself to feel something close to peace. It was then that he heard the sound that would change everything. A crash, distant but distinct, carried through the howling wind. Thomas lifted his head, listening. Another crash, closer now, followed by the unmistakable whinny of a horse in distress. He grabbed his cloak from its hook near the door and pulled it around his shoulders, then lifted the heavy beam that barred the stable entrance and stepped out into the storm. The cold struck him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and burning his exposed skin. Snow swirled around him in blinding eddies, and he could see nothing beyond the reach of his own arm. But the sounds guided him, the frantic cries of a horse somewhere to his left, and he pushed forward through drifts that threatened to swallow him, his legs burning with the effort. He found the overturned carriage at the edge of the manor road, its wheels still spinning uselessly in the air, its horses tangled in their harnesses and screaming with terror. One of the animals had broken its leg and thrashed in the snow, its dark blood staining the white around it. Thomas felt his heart clench at the sight, but he forced himself to move past it, to search the wreckage for passengers. He found her half buried in a drift, thrown from the carriage by the force of the crash. She lay motionless, her face pale as the snow that surrounded her, her dark hair spread around her head like a halo of shadow. She wore a traveling cloak of deep blue velvet, trimmed with ermine, and beneath it, a gown of silk that marked her as someone far above his station. Her hands were bare, her fingers already turning blue with cold, and when Thomas knelt beside her and pressed his fingers to her throat, he felt only the faintest flutter of a pulse. He did not think. He could not afford to think. He gathered her in his arms, marveling at how light she seemed, how fragile, and he carried her back through the storm to the stable, his legs trembling with exhaustion, his lungs burning with each frozen breath. The wind fought him at every step, trying to tear her from his grasp, but he held her close against his chest and refused to surrender. Inside the stable, he laid her on a bed of fresh hay in the corner nearest the brazier, where the coals still glowed with fading warmth. He added fuel to the fire, coaxing it back to life, then knelt beside her and began to work with the desperate efficiency of a man who understood that death was patient, but never idle. Her cloak was soaked through, heavy with melted snow, and he stripped it from her with hands that trembled not from cold, but from the awareness of what he was doing. Her gown beneath was damp as well, clinging to her form in ways that made him avert his eyes even as he worked to save her life. He wrapped her in horse blankets, rough wool that smelled of animals and leather, and he chafed her hands between his own, trying to force warmth back into her frozen flesh. She did not stir. Thomas worked through the night, feeding the fire, adjusting her blankets, pressing warm stones wrapped in cloth against her feet and hands. He spoke to her in the same soft voice he used with frightened horses, telling her stories of nothing at all, of summers long past and springs yet to come, of the way the meadows would bloom with wildflowers when the snow finally melted. He did not know if she could hear him. He only knew that silence felt too much like surrender. It was near dawn when she finally opened her eyes. They were gray, the color of storm clouds heavy with rain, and they fixed upon his face with an intensity that made him forget to breathe. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows across the stable walls, and the horses shifted in their stalls, sensing the change in the air. She was beautiful. Not merely beautiful, but achingly so, in the way of paintings he had glimpsed through manor windows, of stories told by traveling minstrels about ladies in towers and knights who loved them from afar. Her face was oval, her features delicate, her lips the color of winter roses, and her eyes, those gray eyes that held his gaze without flinching, seemed to see past his worn clothes and calloused hands to something beneath that he himself had never known existed. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice rough from cold and disuse. "The stables of Ashford Manor, my lady," Thomas replied, his own voice barely above a breath. "Your carriage overturned in the storm. I found you in the snow." She was silent for a moment, processing this information. Then, slowly, she lifted one hand from beneath the blankets and looked at it, at the roughness of the wool against her skin, at the hay that clung to her fingers. When she spoke again, her voice carried something that might have been wonder. "You saved my life." It was not a question. Thomas nodded, unable to find words. She studied his face for a long moment, her gray eyes moving across his features as though memorizing them, and then she did something that he would remember for the rest of his days. She smiled. "I am Lady Eleanor Blackwood," she said, "and it seems I owe you a debt that cannot easily be repaid." Thomas shook his head, lowering his gaze to the floor. "You owe me nothing, my lady. Any man would have done the same." "Perhaps," she replied, and there was something in her voice now, a warmth that the fire alone could not explain. "But any man did not. You did." She reached out then, her fingers still cold but growing warmer, and touched his hand where it rested on his knee. The contact was brief, lasting no longer than a heartbeat, but Thomas felt it burn through him like lightning through a summer sky. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but within the stable, something new had begun to stir. The hours that followed passed in a strange suspension of time, as though the world beyond the stable walls had ceased to exist. Lady Eleanor drifted in and out of sleep, her body slowly recovering from its ordeal, and Thomas watched over her with the vigilance of a man who understood that miracles were fragile things, easily shattered by inattention. He brought her water from the well, warmed over the brazier until it steamed. He offered her dried apples and hard bread from his own meager stores, apologizing for the humble fare even as she accepted it with a grace that made him feel as though he were presenting her with a feast. When she was awake, they talked. At first, their conversations were careful things, bounded by the invisible walls of station and propriety. She asked about the horses, and he told her their names and temperaments, describing each animal with a fondness that made her smile. He asked about her journey, and she explained that she had been traveling to visit her cousin in York, a trip that her father, Lord Blackwood of Thornfield, had forbidden, but that she had undertaken anyway, unable to bear another winter trapped within walls that felt more like a prison than a home. "My father wishes me to marry," she said, her voice flat with resignation. "Lord Redmond of Hartfield, a man 3 times my age with a fortune built on the suffering of others. He believes the match will bring our family's power. I believe it will bring me only misery." Thomas did not know what to say. The concerns of nobles were foreign to him, their marriages and alliances as distant as the stars. But he understood misery. He understood the weight of a life not chosen, of a future that offered no escape. "I am sorry, my lady," he said finally. "I wish there was something I could do." Lady Eleanor looked at him then, her gray eyes soft in the firelight. You are doing something, she replied. You are listening. You cannot imagine how rare that is. The storm began to weaken as the second night approached, the wind dying to whispers, the snow falling more gently now, as though exhausted by its own fury. Thomas knew that morning would bring discovery. The Ashford household would send men to search for survivors of the carriage wreck. Lady Eleanor would be found, returned to her father, delivered to her fate. But that night, they had only each other and the warmth of the fire. She asked him to sit beside her, and he obeyed, lowering himself onto the hay with the awkward carefulness of a man who knew he was trespassing in territory not meant for him. She did not seem to notice his discomfort. Instead, she reached for his hand again, and this time she held it. "Tell me about yourself," she said. "Not about the horses or the manor, about you. Who is Thomas Hale?" He did not know how to answer. No one had ever asked him such a question. He was a stable hand, a servant, a man whose existence was defined entirely by his usefulness to others. But something in her voice, some genuine curiosity that he had never encountered before, loosened his tongue. He told her about his mother, dead from plague when he was barely more than a child. He told her about the years of hunger that followed, of sleeping in barns and begging for scraps, of the day when the Ashford steward had found him trying to steal a loaf of bread and, instead of having him whipped, had offered him work in the stables. He told her about the horses that had become his family, the only creatures in the world who did not judge him for the circumstances of his birth. Lady Eleanor listened without interruption, her thumb tracing slow circles on the back of his hand. When he finished, she was silent for a long moment. "You have suffered greatly," she said at last, "and yet you show only kindness. How is that possible?" Thomas shrugged, uncomfortable with her scrutiny. "Cruelty costs nothing, my lady. Kindness costs little more. I choose the path that lets me sleep at night." She smiled at that, a smile that transformed her face into something radiant. "You are a philosopher, Thomas Hale. I am a stable hand, my lady. Nothing more." "You are wrong," she replied, and there was something in her voice now that made his heart stumble in his chest. "You are so much more than you know." The fire crackled between them, casting their shadows long against the stable walls. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, and the first pale hint of moonlight began to filter through the gaps in the wooden planks. The world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. It was Lady Eleanor who moved first. She leaned toward him, her gray eyes never leaving his, and pressed her lips against his mouth. The kiss was soft, tentative, the kiss of a woman who had never kissed anyone before and was not entirely certain she was doing it correctly. But to Thomas, it was the most devastating thing he had ever experienced. His entire body came alive with sensation, every nerve singing with a pleasure that bordered on pain. He knew he should pull away. He knew that what they were doing was forbidden, dangerous, the kind of transgression that could cost him his life. But he did not pull away. Instead, he kissed her back, his rough hands cupping her face with a gentleness that surprised them both. She made a small sound against his mouth, a sound of wonder and discovery, and pressed herself closer to him, her fingers tangling in his hair. Time ceased to have meaning. The world narrowed to the warmth of her body against his, the taste of her lips, the soft rhythm of her breath. They held each other in the firelight, two souls who had never expected to find each other, savoring a moment that they both knew could not last. When they finally broke apart, Lady Eleanor rested her forehead against his, her eyes closed, her breathing unsteady. "I have never done anything like that before," she whispered. "Neither have I," Thomas admitted. She laughed softly, a sound like bells in the stillness. "Then we are both fools together. The best kind of fools, my lady." She opened her eyes and looked at him, and there was something in her gaze now that made his chest ache with a longing he could not name. "Eleanor," she said, "when we are alone like this, call me Eleanor." He nodded, unable to speak. She smiled again and settled against his chest, her head resting over his heart. "Stay with me," she murmured, "just for tonight. Tomorrow I will return to my cage. But tonight, let me pretend that I am free." Thomas wrapped his arms around her and held her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the warmth of her body against his. Outside, the moonlight grew stronger, painting the snow in shades of silver and blue. He knew that what they were doing was madness. He knew that the morning would bring consequences he could not imagine. But in that moment, with her heartbeat echoing against his own, he could not bring himself to care. For one night, they were just two people who had found each other in a storm. For one night, that was enough. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. Stories like this one are rare, crafted with care to touch your heart and stay with you long after the final word. Subscribe now and never miss a tale that matters. Morning arrived like an executioner, patient and inevitable. Thomas woke to the sound of voices outside the stable, men calling to one another across the snow-covered courtyard, their words sharp with urgency. He opened his eyes and found Lady Eleanor still pressed against his chest, her breathing soft and even, her face peaceful in sleep. For a moment, he allowed himself to simply look at her, to memorize the curve of her cheek, the dark sweep of her lashes, the way the early light caught the strands of her hair and turned them to silk. Then reality crashed down upon him like a wave upon rocks. He moved carefully, trying not to wake her, but she stirred at once, her gray eyes opening with the instant alertness of someone who had learned to be wary even in sleep. She looked at him, then at the door, where the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder with each passing second. "They are coming," she said. It was not a question. Thomas nodded. "You should straighten your clothes, my lady, and your hair. They cannot know that you spent the night here. They cannot know about us." The word hung between them, heavy with meaning. Lady Eleanor reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw with a tenderness that made his throat tighten. "I will never forget this night," she whispered. "Whatever happens, Thomas, I want you to know that." Before he could respond, the stable door burst open, and 3 men rushed inside, their cloaks dusted with snow, their faces red with cold and exertion. Thomas recognized them at once. The leader was Sir Geoffrey Marsh, the captain of Lord Ashford's guard, a stern man with a reputation for efficiency and a complete absence of mercy. The 2 men behind him were common soldiers, their hands resting on the hilts of their swords. Sir Geoffrey's eyes swept the stable, taking in the scene before him. The young noblewoman wrapped in horse blankets, the stable hand kneeling beside her, the remnants of a fire that had burned through the night. "Lady Blackwood," he said, his voice flat, "your father has been searching for you. He arrived at the manor not 2 hours past, half mad with worry. It seems your carriage was found overturned on the road, and there was fear that you had perished in the storm." Lady Eleanor rose to her feet, with a grace that seemed impossible given the circumstances, drawing the rough blankets around her like a queen donning ermine robes. "As you can see, Sir Geoffrey, I am very much alive. Thanks to this man who found me in the snow and brought me here to warm myself by the fire." Sir Geoffrey's gaze shifted to Thomas, and there was something in his eyes that made the young stable-hand's blood run cold. Suspicion, calculation. The look of a man who was already constructing a narrative that would serve his own purposes. "Is this true, boy?" he demanded. "You found the lady and brought her here?" Thomas nodded, keeping his eyes lowered in the manner expected of a servant addressing his betters. "Yes, my lord. Her carriage had overturned. She was near frozen when I found her. I did only what any man would have done." "Any man?" Sir Geoffrey repeated, his voice dripping with something that might have been contempt or might have been accusation. "And you tended to her through the night? Alone? Without seeking assistance from the manor household?" "The storm was too fierce, my lord. I could not leave her alone to seek help, and I could not carry her through the snow to the main house. I did what I thought was best." Sir Geoffrey studied him for a long moment, his eyes missing nothing. Then he turned back to Lady Eleanor, his expression smoothing into something resembling courtesy. "Your father awaits you in the great hall, my lady. He is most anxious to see you safe and well. If you will permit me, I will escort you to him at once." Lady Eleanor hesitated. Her eyes flickered to Thomas, and in that brief glance he saw everything she could not say aloud. Gratitude, regret, a sorrow so deep that it seemed to age her years in a single heartbeat. "Of course, Sir Geoffrey," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor Thomas could see in her hands. "Lead the way." She moved toward the door, then paused and turned back. "This man saved my life," she said, addressing Sir Geoffrey but speaking to the room at large. I expect him to be rewarded, not punished. Is that understood?" Sir Geoffrey bowed, though his eyes remained cold. "Of course, my lady. Lord Ashford is a just man. He will see that the boy receives what he deserves." The words hung in the air like a threat wrapped in silk. Lady Eleanor held Thomas's gaze for one final moment, a moment in which entire conversations passed without a single word being spoken. Then she was gone, swept away by the tide of her station and her duty, leaving Thomas alone in the stable that had become, for one impossible night, the entire world. The hours that followed were among the longest of Thomas's life. He tended to the horses with mechanical efficiency, his hands performing familiar tasks while his mind raced through every possible consequence of what had transpired. He knew that he should feel afraid. A stable hand who had spent the night alone with a noblewoman, regardless of the circumstances, was a stable hand who had placed his head upon the chopping block. The laws of the land were clear on such matters. The punishment for a commoner who dared to touch a lady of breeding was not merely death, but death preceded by torments designed to serve as a warning to others who might harbor similar ambitions. And yet, try as he might, Thomas could not bring himself to regret what had happened. The memory of Eleanor's lips against his, of her body warm against his chest, of her voice whispering his name in the firelight, these memories were worth any price. If he was to die for loving above his station, then at least he would die knowing that he had lived, truly lived, for one night in his brief and unremarkable existence. It was late afternoon when Sir Geoffrey returned. He came alone this time, closing the stable door behind him with a deliberate care that made Thomas's heart begin to pound. The captain moved through the space like a predator surveying its territory, his boots leaving dark prints in the hay, his eyes never leaving Thomas's face. "You have created quite a problem, boy," Sir Geoffrey said at last. "Lady Blackwood has spoken most highly of you to her father. She claims that you behaved with perfect honor, that you saved her life at risk of your own, that you are deserving of commendation rather than censure." Thomas said nothing. He had learned long ago that silence was often the safest response when dealing with those who held power over him. "Lord Blackwood is inclined to believe his daughter," Sir Geoffrey continued. "He is a sentimental man, easily moved by tales of heroism and sacrifice. He has already spoken to Lord Ashford about rewarding you with a purse of gold and a promotion to head groom." Still Thomas remained silent, though hope flickered briefly in his chest before he could suppress it. Sir Geoffrey smiled then, a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. "But I am not a sentimental man, boy. I have served in great houses my entire life. I have seen how young ladies look at the men who rescue them, and I have seen how stable hands look at young ladies whose virtue they have compromised." "I did nothing improper, my lord," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the fear that coiled in his stomach like a serpent. "I would never dishonor Lady Blackwood in any way." "Perhaps," Sir Geoffrey replied. "Perhaps not. But here is what I know, boy. Lady Eleanor is promised to Lord Redmond of Hartfield. The betrothal was arranged by her father 3 months past. The wedding is to take place in the spring, when the roads are clear and the guests can travel from across the kingdom to witness the union. Lord Redmond is a powerful man, a wealthy man, a man who would not look kindly upon rumors that his bride had spent a night alone with a peasant in a stable." Thomas felt his blood turn to ice. "I see you understand," Sir Geoffrey said, satisfaction evident in his tone. "Good. Then you will understand why it is necessary for you to leave this place. Tonight, before Lady Eleanor departs with her father, before any complications can arise." "Leave?" Thomas repeated, the word foreign in his mouth. "But this is my home. I have served Lord Ashford faithfully for 9 years. Where would I go?" Sir Geoffrey shrugged, the gesture eloquent in its indifference. "That is not my concern. The roads lead in many directions. Choose one. Walk until you find somewhere else that will take you. Or do not walk, and face the consequences of remaining." "What consequences?" The captain's smile widened. "Lord Redmond is not a forgiving man. If he were to learn that his betrothed had spent a night in the arms of a stable hand, he would demand satisfaction. And I assure you, boy, the satisfaction he would demand would involve a great deal of screaming on your part before it involved any dying." Thomas closed his eyes, his mind reeling. He thought of Eleanor, of her gray eyes and her gentle hands, of the way she had smiled when she kissed him. He thought of the future that Sir Geoffrey was describing, a future of running and hiding, of looking over his shoulder for the rest of his days. Then he thought of the alternative, of staying, of fighting for something he could never have. "I will go," he said at last, the words tasting like ash on his tongue. "But I have one request." Sir Geoffrey raised an eyebrow. "You are hardly in a position to make requests, boy." "I know, my lord, but I ask anyway. Please, please tell Lady Eleanor that I am sorry. Tell her that I did not want to leave. Tell her that I—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Sir Geoffrey studied him for a long moment, and something flickered in his eyes. Not sympathy, exactly. Perhaps recognition. The recognition of one man who understood what it meant to love something beyond his reach. "I will tell her nothing," the captain said finally. "And neither will you. You will leave tonight, through the back gate, and you will never speak of what passed between you and Lady Blackwood. If you do, I will find you, and I will ensure that you spend your final hours regretting that you ever drew breath." He turned and walked toward the door, then paused with his hand on the latch. "The purse of gold that Lord Blackwood wished to give you is in the saddlebag on the third hook. I convinced him that you had already received it and departed on an errand. Take it and go. It is more than you deserve, and far less than you will need." Then he was gone, leaving Thomas alone with the horses and the silence and the shattered remains of everything he had ever known. Thomas left that night, as Sir Geoffrey had commanded. He took only what he could carry: the purse of gold, his warmest clothes, a knife that had belonged to his mother, and a small figurine of a horse that he had carved himself during the long winter evenings. He saddled none of the horses, unwilling to add theft to the list of transgressions that already hung over his head. Instead, he walked, his boots crunching through the snow, his breath misting in the frozen air. At the back gate, he paused and looked up at the manor house. The windows blazed with candlelight, and he could hear the distant sound of music drifting across the courtyard. A feast, perhaps, to celebrate Lady Eleanor's safe return. Or perhaps a farewell dinner before she departed with her father to prepare for her wedding. He wondered if she was thinking of him. He wondered if she knew that he was leaving. He wondered if she would hate him for not saying goodbye. Then he turned away from the light and the music and the life he had known, and he walked into the darkness. The road stretched before him like a ribbon of shadow, winding through forests and fields, leading to a future he could not imagine. He did not know where he was going. He did not know what he would do when he got there. He knew only that he was leaving behind the only woman he had ever loved, and that he would carry the weight of that loss for the rest of his days. The snow began to fall again, soft and silent, covering his footprints as though he had never existed. 6 months passed like water through fingers, each day blurring into the next, until Thomas could barely remember what it felt like to have a home. He had traveled south at first, following the roads toward London, seeking work in the great city that he had heard about in stories but never seen. The journey had taken 3 weeks, through villages decimated by the last winter's harshness, through forests where outlaws lurked in the shadows, through river crossings swollen with spring melt that threatened to sweep him away with every step. London had been everything the stories promised and nothing like he had imagined. The streets teemed with people, more people than Thomas had seen in his entire life, pressed together in a chaos of noise and smell and motion that made his head spin. The air tasted of smoke and sewage and something else, something electric with possibility and danger. He had found work in a livery stable near Cheapside, tending horses for merchants and minor nobles who passed through the city on their way to somewhere else. The pay was poor, the conditions worse, but it was enough to keep him fed and sheltered. And that was all he could ask for. He tried not to think about Eleanor. He failed. She haunted his dreams, appearing in the darkness with her gray eyes and her gentle smile, reaching for him with hands that dissolved into mist the moment he tried to touch them. He would wake gasping, his heart pounding, the echo of her voice still ringing in his ears. During the day, he threw himself into work with a desperate intensity, hoping that exhaustion would bring dreamless sleep. It never did. He heard news of her wedding in April. A traveling merchant mentioned it in passing, remarking on the grand celebration that Lord Redmond had hosted at his estate in Hartfield. 300 guests, a feast that lasted 7 days. a bride so beautiful that men wept to look upon her. Thomas listened without expression, then excused himself and walked to the river, where he stood for hours watching the water flow past, carrying debris and dreams and everything else toward the distant sea. It was in May that everything changed. He was mucking out a stall when the messenger arrived, a young boy in the livery of a noble house, his face flushed with the importance of his errand. "I seek Thomas Hale," the boy announced, his voice carrying across the stable yard. "Formerly of Ashford Manor in the north." Thomas straightened slowly, his heart beginning to race. No one should know that name. No one should know where he had come from. Sir Geoffrey had promised him anonymity in exchange for his silence. "Who asks?" he replied, keeping his voice carefully neutral. The boy consulted a scroll in his hand. "Lady Eleanor Redmond, formerly Blackwood, requests your presence at her residence in Hartfield. She has sent this purse to cover your traveling expenses and asks that you come with all possible haste." He held out a velvet pouch that clinked with the unmistakable sound of gold. Thomas stared at it as though it were a serpent poised to strike. Eleanor. Lady Eleanor. She had found him. After all these months, after all the distance he had put between them, she had found him. "Why?" he managed to ask. "Why does she want to see me?" The boy shrugged, clearly uninterested in the dramas of his betters. "I was not told, sir. Only that the matter is urgent and that you are to come at once." Thomas hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to refuse, to send the boy away, to disappear into the labyrinth of London streets and never be found again. Going to Hartfield meant placing himself within reach of Lord Redmond, the man who had married the woman Thomas loved, the man who would surely kill him if he learned the truth of what had passed between them. But it also meant seeing Eleanor again. In the end, that was all that mattered. He took the purse from the boy's hand and began to pack his meager belongings. The journey to Hartfield took 4 days on horseback, riding through the green countryside that had burst into life with the coming of spring. Thomas barely noticed the beauty around him, his mind consumed with questions he could not answer. Why had Eleanor summoned him? What urgent matter could require his presence after so many months of silence? Was this a trap, orchestrated by Sir Geoffrey or Lord Redmond to draw him out of hiding? He arrived at the Redmond estate on an afternoon heavy with the threat of rain. The manor was larger than Ashford, its stone walls rising 3 stories above manicured gardens, its windows gleaming with expensive glass that caught the gray light like scattered jewels. Guards stood at the gate, their hands resting on their weapons, their eyes following Thomas with the professional suspicion of men trained to identify threats. He gave his name, and the gates swung open. A steward met him in the courtyard, a thin man with a pinched face and the manner of someone who had spent his life judging others and finding them wanting. "Lady Eleanor will receive you in the solar," the steward announced. "Follow me and speak to no one. Your presence here is to remain confidential." Thomas nodded and followed, his heart pounding so loudly he was certain the entire household could hear it. The solar was a small room on the 2nd floor, its walls hung with tapestries depicting hunting scenes, its windows overlooking a garden where roses had begun to bloom. A fire burned in the hearth despite the warmth of the day, and seated beside it, wrapped in a shawl of deep blue wool, was Eleanor. She had changed. It took Thomas a moment to understand what he was seeing, his mind refusing to process the evidence before his eyes. She was thin, far thinner than he remembered, her cheekbones prominent beneath skin that had taken on a grayish pallor. Her gray eyes, once bright with intelligence and curiosity, were shadowed now, rimmed with dark circles that spoke of sleepless nights. And there was something else, something in the way she held herself, one hand resting protectively over her stomach. She was with child. Eleanor looked up as he entered, and for a moment her face transformed with an emotion so raw that it stole his breath. "Thomas," she whispered. "You came." He wanted to run to her, to gather her in his arms, to demand an explanation for everything that had happened. Instead, he stood frozen in the doorway, his hands clenched at his sides, his voice trapped somewhere between his chest and his throat. "My lady," he managed at last, "you summoned me." She rose slowly, one hand still pressed against her stomach, and crossed the room to stand before him. She was so close that he could smell the lavender oil in her hair, so close that he could see the faint tremor in her lower lip. Close the door, she said. What I am about to tell you must remain between us. Thomas obeyed, his fingers fumbling with the latch. When he turned back, Eleanor had returned to her chair, and there were tears tracking silently down her cheeks. I am dying, Thomas, she said, her voice steady despite the tears. The physicians have told me that my heart is weak, that it has been weak since childhood, that the strain of carrying a child may well kill me before the year is out. Thomas felt the floor tilt beneath his feet. No, he heard himself say. No, that cannot be true. You were well when I knew you. You were strong. I was never strong, Eleanor replied, a sad smile touching her lips. I was only good at pretending. My father knew the truth, which is why he was so eager to marry me off before anyone else could discover it. A noblewoman with a weak heart is a poor bargain for any man. But Lord Redmond wanted an heir more than he wanted a healthy wife, so the match was made. She paused, her hand moving in small circles over her stomach. But there is something else, Thomas. Something that I have told no one, not even my husband. Something that you must know. Thomas waited, his heart pounding. Eleanor lifted her gray eyes to his, and in them he saw everything she could not say aloud. Fear, hope, love. The child I carry, she whispered. It is not Lord Redmond's. The words hung in the air between them, impossible and undeniable. The timing, Eleanor continued, her voice barely audible. I have counted the days 100 times, 1,000 times. Lord Redmond did not come to my bed until a fortnight after our wedding night, and by then, I was already carrying. The child was conceived in a stable, Thomas, on a night when a storm raged outside and everything I thought I knew about the world fell away. Thomas could not breathe. He could not think. He could only stare at the woman before him, at the gentle curve of her stomach beneath her gown, at the life growing inside her that was half his own. I wanted you to know, Eleanor said, her tears falling faster now. Before I die, I wanted you to know that our night together gave me something precious. Something that Lord Redmond believes is his heir, the continuation of his bloodline, the justification for his entire existence. And I wanted you to know that I have not forgotten you, not for a single moment since we parted. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers cold against his skin. I am asking nothing of you, Thomas. I know that you cannot claim the child, that doing so would mean your death and possibly mine as well. But I needed you to understand why I summoned you. I needed to see your face one more time. I needed to tell you that I love you, that I have always loved you, that the night we shared was the only true happiness I have ever known. Thomas sank to his knees before her, his hands clasping hers, his vision blurring with tears he had not known he was capable of shedding. I love you, he said, the words torn from somewhere deep inside him. I have loved you since the moment you opened your eyes in that stable. I will love you until the moment I draw my last breath. If this story is touching your heart, pause now and leave a comment saying, some love stories are written in the stars, but the most beautiful ones are written in silence. I would love to know if this tale has moved you as deeply as it has moved me. Eleanor smiled through her tears, and for a moment, she was the woman he remembered. Young, beautiful, alive with a fierce joy that no illness could extinguish. Then stay, she whispered. Not here, not in this house where danger lurks in every shadow, but nearby. There is a village an hour's ride from the estate, and I have arranged for you to have lodging there. I will send word when I can, and when the child is born, I will find a way for you to see it, to know that some part of us continues, even after I am gone. Thomas wanted to argue, to insist that he would not leave her side, that he would fight anyone who tried to separate them. But he saw the truth in her eyes, the acceptance of a fate she could not escape. I will stay, he promised, for as long as you need me, for as long as there is breath in my body. Eleanor leaned forward and pressed her lips to his forehead, a benediction and a farewell. Thank you, my love, she murmured. Thank you for giving me hope. Thomas settled in the village of Millbrook, a small collection of cottages and farms that huddled in the shadow of the Redmond estate, like a child pressing close to a parent. He found work with a blacksmith who asked no questions and paid fair wages, and he rented a room above the village tavern, a cramped space with a narrow bed and a window that looked out toward the distant towers of Hartfield Manor. Every night he would stand at that window and watch the lights burning in the great house, wondering which one marked Eleanor's chamber, wondering if she was thinking of him as he thought of her. Word came rarely, delivered by trusted servants who appeared in the tavern with messages hidden in their cloaks. Eleanor was well. Eleanor was resting. The pregnancy was progressing as expected. Each message brought both relief and fresh torment, a reminder that the woman he loved was so close and yet utterly beyond his reach. Summer ripened into autumn, the fields around Millbrook turning gold with harvest, the air growing crisp with the promise of the coming cold. Thomas worked and waited, his days blurring into a routine of hammer and forge and sleepless nights. The villagers regarded him with curiosity at first, then with acceptance, then with something approaching friendship. He was Thomas the blacksmith's helper, a quiet man with sad eyes who kept to himself and never spoke of his past. It was October when the message came that changed everything. The servant was a woman this time, an older woman with gray hair and worried eyes who introduced herself as Martha, Lady Eleanor's personal maid. "The child is coming," Martha whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "The physicians say it will be tonight or tomorrow at the latest. My lady asks that you come to the manor. There is a servant's entrance on the north side that is unguarded after midnight. I will wait for you there." Thomas felt his heart stop, then restart with a painful lurch. "Is she well?" he demanded. "Is she in danger?" Martha's eyes filled with tears that she quickly blinked away. "She is strong, sir. Stronger than any of us believed. But the physicians are concerned. They say that the birth will be difficult and that my lady's heart may not withstand the strain." Thomas did not hesitate. He grabbed his cloak and followed Martha into the night. The journey to Hartfield Manor passed in a blur of shadows and starlight. They moved through the forest that bordered the estate, following paths that Martha clearly knew by heart, avoiding the main roads where guards might be patrolling. The moon was full, casting silver light across the landscape, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called out its lonely greeting. The servant's entrance was exactly where Martha had promised, a small door set into the north wall of the manor, half hidden by ivy and forgotten by all but those who had reason to use it. Martha produced a key from her pocket and unlocked the door, then led Thomas through a labyrinth of corridors that seemed to wind endlessly through the bowels of the great house. They emerged at last into a wing of the manor that felt different from the rest, warmer, more intimate. The walls were hung with paintings of flowers and landscapes, the floors covered with thick carpets that muffled their footsteps. Candles burned in sconces along the hallway, casting a soft light that flickered with each breath of air. Martha stopped before a door at the end of the corridor and knocked 3 times in quick succession. A moment later, the door opened, and Thomas found himself face to face with Eleanor. She was pale, paler than he had ever seen her, her gray eyes enormous in her thin face. She wore a nightgown of white linen, her dark hair hanging loose around her shoulders, and her belly was swollen with the child that strained against the fabric. She looked fragile, breakable, like a porcelain doll that might shatter at the slightest touch. And yet, when she saw him, she smiled. "You came," she said, and there was wonder in her voice, as though she had not quite believed he would. "Always," Thomas replied. "I will always come when you call." She reached for his hand and pulled him into the room, closing the door behind them. The chamber was warm, a fire blazing in the hearth, the bed piled high with blankets and pillows. A physician hovered near the window, a thin man with nervous eyes who barely glanced at Thomas before returning his attention to the instruments laid out on a nearby table. "I wanted you here," Eleanor said, her grip on his hand tightening. "Whatever happens tonight, I wanted you to be here, to see our child enter the world, to know that some part of us will continue, even if I do not." Thomas shook his head, his throat too tight to speak. He wanted to tell her that she would survive, that they would find a way to be together, that the future was not as hopeless as she believed. But the words would not come, trapped behind a wall of fear that he could not breach. The contractions began shortly after midnight. They came in waves, each one stronger than the last, and Eleanor bore them with a courage that broke Thomas's heart. She gripped his hand so tightly that her nails drew blood, but he did not pull away. He stayed beside her through every scream, every sob, every moment of agony that stretched into eternity. The physician worked with quiet efficiency, his hands moving with practiced precision, his voice a low murmur of instruction and encouragement. Martha hovered nearby, ready with clean linens and warm water, her face a mask of calm that did not quite hide the terror in her eyes. Hours passed. The fire burned low and was replenished. The candles guttered and were replaced. Outside the window, the sky began to lighten with the first gray hints of dawn. And then, at last, a cry. Not Eleanor's cry, but the cry of a newborn, thin and reedy and impossibly beautiful. The physician lifted a small, squirming bundle from between Eleanor's legs and held it up for her to see. "A boy," he announced. "A healthy boy." Eleanor laughed, a sound that was half sob, and reached for the child that was placed in her arms. She looked down at the tiny face, at the dark hair and the gray eyes that were already beginning to focus, and tears streamed down her cheeks. "He has your eyes," she whispered to Thomas. "Do you see? He has your eyes." Thomas looked at his son for the first time, and something inside him broke and reformed in the same instant. He had never known that love could be so overwhelming, so absolute, so terrifying in its intensity. He loved this child with a fierceness that defied explanation, loved him with every fiber of his being, loved him in a way that he had never known he was capable of loving anything. "What will you call him?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. Eleanor smiled, her gray eyes soft in the candlelight. "William," she said, "after my grandfather, who was the kindest man I ever knew. But in my heart, he will always be Thomas. Always and forever." Thomas leaned forward and kissed her forehead, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the warmth of her skin against his lips. "I love you," he whispered. "Both of you, more than I can ever say." Eleanor's eyes closed, and for a moment she looked peaceful, content, as though she had finally found what she had been searching for her entire life. Then the physician's sharp intake of breath shattered the moment. "My lady," he said, his voice suddenly urgent. "My lady, you must stay awake. You must not sleep." But Eleanor did not respond. Her grip on Thomas's hand loosened, and her breathing grew shallow, each breath coming slower than the last. Thomas looked up at the physician, his heart filling with a dread he could not name. "What is happening?" he demanded. "What is wrong?" The physician shook his head, his face pale. "Her heart," he said. "It is failing. I feared this might happen. The strain of the birth was too much." "Do something!" Thomas shouted. "You must do something!" But there was nothing to be done. Eleanor's breathing slowed, then stopped. Her face relaxed into an expression of perfect peace, her lips curved in the ghost of a smile. She lay still and silent, her dark hair spread across the pillow like a halo of shadow, her hand still resting on the child she would never see grow. Thomas sat beside her for a long time, holding her hand, unable to accept what his eyes were telling him. The candles burned down to nothing. The fire died to embers. The dawn light crept through the window, painting the room in shades of gold and rose. Martha finally broke the silence, her voice trembling with grief. "Sir," she said, "you must go. Lord Redmond will be informed soon, and if he finds you here—" Thomas nodded slowly, his movements mechanical. He leaned forward and kissed Eleanor's lips one final time, tasting the salt of his own tears. "I will always love you," he whispered, "in this life and whatever comes after." Then he released her hand and turned to Martha. "The child," he said. "What will happen to my son?" Martha's face was wet with tears. "He will be raised as Lord Redmond's heir," she replied. "No one will ever know the truth. My lady made me swear to protect that secret with my life." Thomas closed his eyes, pain lancing through him like a blade. His son would grow up believing he was the child of another man, would grow up in wealth and privilege, never knowing that his true father was a penniless stable hand who had loved his mother more than life itself. But he would be safe. He would be cared for. He would have opportunities that Thomas could never have provided. It was enough. It had to be enough. "Take care of him," Thomas said. "Promise me that you will take care of him." Martha nodded, her voice breaking. "With my life, sir. With my very life." Thomas took one last look at Eleanor, memorizing her face, burning her image into his heart where it would remain until his dying day. Then he turned and walked out of the chamber, out of the manor, out of the life that might have been. The sun was rising over Hartfield as he made his way back to Millbrook, painting the world in colors so beautiful they seemed almost cruel. He walked without seeing, his mind consumed by grief, his heart shattered beyond repair. He did not know how he would continue. He did not know how he would face the days and weeks and years that stretched before him, empty of everything that had given his life meaning. But he would try. For Eleanor, for William, for the love that had changed him forever. He would try. 5 years passed like seasons through a window, each one leaving its mark upon the world and the man who watched it change. Thomas remained in Millbrook, working at the forge, building a life from the ashes of his grief. The villagers had long since stopped asking questions about his past, accepting him as one of their own, a quiet man with skilled hands and a kind heart who never spoke of where he had come from or what he had lost. He thought of Eleanor every day. He thought of her when he woke in the morning, the dawn light reminding him of the color of her eyes. He thought of her when he worked at the anvil, the rhythm of the hammer echoing the beat of his broken heart. He thought of her when he lay down at night, her face the last thing he saw before sleep claimed him. He thought of William, too. Martha sent word when she could, brief messages that arrived with traveling merchants or delivered by servants who had reason to visit the village. The boy was healthy. The boy was growing. The boy had dark hair and gray eyes and a laugh that sounded like bells in a spring breeze. Lord Redmond doted on his heir, showering him with gifts and attention, already planning the education and alliances that would shape the boy's future. Thomas collected these fragments of information like a miser hoarding gold, treasuring each detail, building an image of his son from scraps of second-hand description. He could not see William. He could not speak to him. He could not reveal himself as the boy's true father, but he could love him from afar, could send silent prayers into the night for his safety and happiness. It was a poor substitute for the life they might have had, but it was all he had. The summer that William turned 5 brought changes that no one could have predicted. A fever swept through the region, striking rich and poor alike, filling the churchyards with fresh graves. Lord Redmond fell ill in July and was dead by August, his great fortune and greater title passing to the child he believed to be his son. Suddenly, William was no longer merely the heir to Hartfield. He was the lord himself, a 5-year-old boy with an estate to manage and enemies circling like wolves around a wounded deer. Martha's messages grew more urgent after the lord's death. There were relatives who contested the inheritance, claiming that William was too young to hold the title, that the estate should be placed under the guardianship of Lord Redmond's brother, a cruel man named Harold who had always resented his siblings' success. There were lawyers and advisors and politicians, all vying for influence over the child who controlled such vast wealth. And there were whispers. Rumors passed in low voices in taverns and markets, questioning whether William was truly Lord Redmond's son. The timing of his birth, some said, was suspect. The late lady had been traveling alone when she was caught in that storm, had spent a night in a stable before being found. Who knew what had happened in those hours when she was beyond the reach of chaperones and propriety? Thomas heard these whispers and felt his blood run cold. If the truth came out, William would lose everything. The title, the inheritance, perhaps even his life, if Lord Harold decided that a bastard's claim to the estate was a threat that must be eliminated. He had to do something. He could not simply stand by and watch his son's future crumble to dust. The decision came to him in the forge one autumn afternoon, as he was shaping a horseshoe from molten iron. He would go to Hartfield. He would find a way to protect William, to ensure that the boy's claim to his inheritance was unassailable. He did not know how he would accomplish this. He knew only that he had to try. Martha met him at the servants' entrance, just as she had on that night 5 years ago when William was born. She had aged since then, her hair more gray than brown, her face lined with worries that she had carried alone for far too long. "Thank God you have come," she said, pulling him into the shadows of the corridor. "Lord Harold arrives tomorrow to press his claim. He has brought lawyers from London and witnesses who will swear that Lady Eleanor was unfaithful. If he succeeds, young William will be cast out as a bastard, stripped of everything. Thomas felt his hands clench into fists. What can be done? Martha shook her head. I do not know. The steward is loyal to the boy, but he has no legal standing to oppose Lord Harold's challenge. The servants will testify to Lady Eleanor's virtue, but our words carry little weight against the accusations of a nobleman. She paused, her eyes searching his face. Unless what? Martha lowered her voice to barely a whisper. There is a document, sir. A letter that Lady Eleanor wrote before she died, confessing the truth of William's parentage. She gave it to me for safekeeping, with instructions that it should only be revealed if William's life or inheritance was ever in danger. Thomas stared at her. A letter? Confessing that William is not Lord Redmond's son? How would that help? You do not understand, sir. The letter does not merely confess. It pleads. Lady Eleanor knew that if the truth came out, William would need a protector, someone who could claim him as his own and fight for his future. She wrote to you, sir. She asked that if the worst should happen, you would step forward and acknowledge William as your son. Thomas felt the ground shift beneath his feet. But that would destroy him. A bastard has no claim to a lordship. He would lose everything. Martha shook her head again. Not necessarily. There is precedent, sir, for a child born of a noblewoman to be legitimized by royal decree, even if the father is a commoner. It requires powerful allies and a fortune in bribes, but it can be done. And Lady Eleanor believed that you were the only person in the world who would fight hard enough to make it happen. She pressed something into his hands. A folded letter, sealed with blue wax, bearing Lady Eleanor's initials. Read it, Martha said. And then decide. But decide quickly. Lord Harold arrives at dawn. Thomas retreated to a small chamber that Martha had prepared for him, a cramped space beneath the eaves where no one would think to look. He sat on the narrow bed and broke the seal on the letter, his hands trembling. Eleanor's handwriting filled the page, elegant and precise, the words she had penned in the final days of her life. My dearest Thomas, if you are reading this letter, then the worst has happened, and our son is in danger. I have always known that this day might come, that the secret we share might someday threaten to destroy everything I have tried to build for William. I do not ask you to sacrifice yourself for him. I know that stepping forward as his father will cost you everything, will mark you as a man who dishonored a noblewoman, will make you a target for all who wish to see William fail. But I also know that you love him. I saw it in your eyes when you held him for the first time, that fierce, overwhelming love that defies all reason and logic. You love him as I love him, as I have loved you since the night we met. If you choose to claim him, know that I will be watching from wherever I am, cheering you on, praying for your success. And know that whatever happens, whatever price you pay, you will have given our son the greatest gift any father can give, the knowledge that he was wanted, that he was loved, that someone was willing to fight for him against the entire world. I love you, Thomas. I have always loved you, and I will love you forever in this life and whatever comes after. Your Eleanor Thomas read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down his face. Then he folded it carefully and placed it over his heart. He knew what he had to do. Dawn broke over Hartfield Manor with a cold gray light that promised neither warmth nor mercy. In the great hall, Lord Harold Redmond stood before the assembled household, his lawyers flanking him like vultures, his witnesses lined up behind him with rehearsed expressions of righteous indignation. He was a large man, Lord Harold, with the kind of face that seemed designed for cruelty. His eyes were small and calculating, his mouth a thin line of perpetual disapproval. He surveyed the hall with the satisfaction of a man who believed victory was already his. We are gathered here to address a matter of grave importance, he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. The legitimacy of the child known as William Redmond, who currently holds the title and estates that rightfully belong to the Redmond family. A murmur rippled through the crowd of servants and retainers. At the front of the hall, seated in a chair that seemed far too large for him, 5-year-old William watched the proceedings with wide gray eyes. Martha stood beside him, one hand resting protectively on his shoulder. I have brought witnesses who will testify that Lady Eleanor Blackwood, the late wife of my brother, was unfaithful during her marriage, Lord Harold continued. That she conceived a child with another man and passed that child off as the legitimate heir to the Redmond fortune. I ask that the title and estates be transferred to me. as the rightful successor, and that the bastard child be removed from this house. The lawyers nodded in unison, producing documents and affidavits that they placed on a table before the hall. The witnesses stepped forward one by one, reciting their prepared statements, each one adding another layer of accusation to the case against the dead woman who could not defend herself. Thomas watched from the shadows at the back of the hall, his heart pounding, his hands clenched at his sides. He had planned to wait, to observe, to choose the perfect moment to make his move. But as he listened to the lies being spoken about Eleanor, as he watched his son's small face grow pale with confusion and fear, he found that he could wait no longer. He stepped out of the shadows and into the light. Stop. The single word cut through the murmur of the crowd like a blade. Lord Harold turned, his small eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of the rough-dressed stranger who had interrupted his triumph. "Who are you?" he demanded. "How dare you disrupt these proceedings?" Thomas walked forward, his steps steady, his gaze fixed on the man who threatened his son's future. "My name is Thomas Hale," he said, his voice carrying clear and strong to every corner of the hall. "I was a stable hand at Ashford Manor 9 years ago, the night that Lady Eleanor's carriage overturned in a storm. I found her in the snow and carried her to safety, and I am the father of the child you are trying to destroy." The hall erupted in chaos. Lord Harold's face contorted with fury. The lawyers scrambled for their documents. The servants gasped and whispered, their eyes darting between Thomas and the small boy who sat frozen in his chair. But Thomas had eyes only for William. His son was staring at him with an expression of shock and wonder, his gray eyes, Eleanor's eyes, wide and searching. There was no recognition there, no understanding of what was happening. There was only the innocent confusion of a child whose world had suddenly tilted on its axis. Thomas dropped to one knee before the boy, bringing himself to eye level. "I know this is hard to understand," he said softly. "I know you do not know me, but I knew your mother, William. I loved her very much, and she loved you more than anything in this world." He reached into his pocket and withdrew the letter, the words that Eleanor had written in her final days. "She asked me to protect you," he continued, "to fight for you, and I am going to keep that promise no matter what it costs." Lord Harold recovered from his shock and pushed forward, his face purple with rage. "This proves nothing," he shouted. "The word of a peasant against the testimony of noblemen? This is absurd. I demand that this man be arrested at once." But the steward of Hartfield, an elderly man named Geoffrey, who had served the Redmond family for 40 years, stepped forward with a raised hand. "My lord," he said, his voice calm but firm, "before any arrests are made, I believe we should examine the evidence that this man has brought. The law requires that all claims to a title be heard fairly, regardless of the station of the claimant." Lord Harold sputtered, but the lawyers nodded reluctantly. The law was the law, even when it inconvenienced those who sought to manipulate it. Thomas handed the letter to the steward, who read it carefully before passing it to the lawyers. The room fell silent as the document made its way from hand to hand, each reader's expression shifting from skepticism to surprise to something approaching wonder. "This letter," one of the lawyers said at last, "is written in Lady Eleanor's own hand. It confirms that the child William was conceived before her marriage to Lord Redmond, during the night she spent in the stable at Ashford Manor." "Which means the boy is a bastard," Lord Harold crowed. "Just as I claimed. The title and estates revert to me." "Not necessarily, my lord," the lawyer replied, his tone measured. "The letter also contains a formal request that Thomas Hale be permitted to acknowledge William as his son and petition the Crown for legitimization. Such petitions have been granted in the past, particularly in cases where the mother was of noble birth and the child's welfare is at stake." Lord Harold's face went from purple to white. "You cannot be serious. The Crown would never legitimize the son of a stable hand." "The Crown has done stranger things," the steward observed, "and I believe that many noble families in this region would be willing to support such a petition, particularly if the alternative is allowing Lord Harold to seize control of the Redmond estates." The implication was clear. Lord Harold was not loved by his peers. His cruelty and greed had made him enemies among the very people whose support he would need to maintain his claim. Thomas rose to his feet, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and terror. "I do not ask for wealth or titles," he said, addressing the room at large. "I ask only that my son be allowed to keep what his mother wanted him to have. I will work for the rest of my life to repay any debts, to prove myself worthy of this trust. But I will not stand by and watch an innocent child be destroyed by greed and lies." A long silence followed his words. Then, slowly, the servants began to nod. The retainers exchanged glances and whispered to one another. Even some of the witnesses that Lord Harold had brought seemed to waver, their rehearsed certainty crumbling in the face of Thomas's obvious sincerity. It was young William who broke the silence. He slid down from his chair and crossed the hall to where Thomas stood. He looked up at the man who claimed to be his father, his gray eyes serious and searching. "Did you really love my mother?" he asked. Thomas knelt again, his throat tight with emotion. "More than anything in this world," he replied. "Except you." William considered this for a moment. Then he reached out and took Thomas's hand in his own. "Then I believe you," he said simply. "And I want you to stay." Thomas looked down at his son's small hand clasped in his own, and he felt something break loose inside him. All the years of grief and loneliness, all the nights spent wondering if he had made the right choice, all the pain of loving from a distance, it all fell away in that single moment of connection. He had found his son. He had found his family. He had found his way home. Lord Harold made one final attempt to salvage his claim, but his lawyers had already begun to pack their documents. The witnesses he had brought were slipping quietly toward the doors. The battle was over, before it had truly begun. In the weeks that followed, Thomas submitted his petition to the crown, supported by letters from a dozen noble families who had known Lady Eleanor and respected her memory. The process was long and expensive, requiring every coin that Thomas had saved and several loans that he would spend years repaying. But in the end, the petition was granted. William was legitimized as Thomas's son, his inheritance secured, his future protected by the combined strength of law and love. Thomas moved into Hartfield Manor, not as a lord, but as a guardian, overseeing his son's education and managing the estate until William came of age. He never forgot his origins, never pretended to be something he was not. He worked alongside the servants when extra hands were needed. He ate his meals in the kitchen when the great hall felt too grand for a former stable hand. He treated every person on the estate with the same respect he had shown to the horses in his care, because he understood that dignity was not a privilege of birth, but a choice of the heart. Years passed. William grew tall and strong, with his mother's gray eyes and his father's gentle hands. He learned to ride and to read, to manage an estate, and to show kindness to those less fortunate. He never forgot the story of how his parents met, the night in the stable when a storm had brought two lonely souls together. And Thomas, watching his son grow into a man any father would be proud of, finally understood the price he had paid and the gift he had received. He had given up everything: his anonymity, his safety, his quiet life in the shadows. He had risked death and disgrace for a woman he could not save and a child he could barely touch. But in return, he had gained something precious beyond measure. He had gained love, real love, the kind that survives secrets and separation, grief and time, the kind that transforms a broken stable hand into a father, a provider, a man worthy of the sacrifice made for him. Eleanor had known. She had always known. Some prices are worth paying. Some debts can only be repaid with a lifetime of devotion, and some love stories, the quiet ones, the impossible ones, are the most beautiful of all. On the anniversary of Eleanor's death, Thomas would walk to the small chapel on the edge of the estate where she was buried. He would lay wildflowers on her grave and speak to her as though she could hear him, telling her about William's latest accomplishments, about the changes on the estate, about the small moments of joy that filled his days. He always ended with the same words. "Thank you," he would whisper, "for the storm, for the stable, for the night that changed everything. I will never stop loving you, and I will never stop being grateful." And sometimes, when the wind was right and the sun was setting over the hills, he could almost hear her answer. A whisper, soft as breath. "I know, my love. I know." Epilogue. Spring at Hartfield. 10 years had passed since the trial in the Great Hall. 10 years of growth and change, of seasons turning and lives unfolding like flowers reaching toward the sun. Thomas stood at the window of his chamber, watching the gardens bloom with the colors of late spring. Roses climbed the stone walls, their petals deep red and palest pink. Lavender swayed in the breeze, filling the air with a scent that always made him think of Eleanor, of the oil she had worn in her hair, of the night they had spent together in the stable. A knock at the door interrupted his reverie. "Father?" He turned to find William standing in the doorway, no longer a boy, but a young man of 15, tall and handsome in his riding clothes. His gray eyes sparkled with excitement. "The tenants are gathering in the village for the spring festival," William said. "They are asking if you will come and judge the horse races this year." Thomas smiled, warmth spreading through his chest. "Tell them I would be honored." William grinned and turned to go, then paused and looked back. "Father?" "Yes?" "I have been thinking about something, about Mother, and about the night you met. You have told me the story many times, but there is one thing I have never understood." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "What is that?" "Why did you stay? After she was gone, I mean. You could have disappeared, gone back to London, built a new life far from here. But you came back for me. You risked everything for a child you had never even held. Why?" Thomas was silent for a long moment, considering the question he had asked himself 1,000 times. "Because she asked me to," he said finally. "And because love, real love, does not end when someone dies. It continues in the promises we keep and the people we protect. Your mother gave me one night of happiness in a lifetime of hardship. I spent every moment after trying to be worthy of that gift." William nodded slowly, his young face thoughtful. "I hope I find a love like that someday," he said. Thomas crossed the room and placed his hands on his son's shoulders. "You will," he promised. "And when you do, hold on to it. Fight for it. Never let it go, no matter what the world says or does. Because love like that, William, love like what your mother and I shared, it is the rarest thing in this world, and it is worth any price." William embraced his father, a quick, fierce hug that said everything words could not. "Thank you, Father," he murmured, "for everything." Then he was gone, bounding down the stairs toward the courtyard where his horse waited, leaving Thomas alone with his memories and his gratitude. He turned back to the window and watched his son ride off toward the village, the morning sunlight catching his dark hair, his mother's grace evident in every movement. A stable hand and a noblewoman. A forbidden night. A price no one expected. And a love that had outlasted death itself. Thomas smiled, tears pricking at his eyes. "We did well, Eleanor," he whispered to the empty room. "We did well. If you watched this far, it is because this story touched your heart. Leave a comment saying, 'I watched this far,' so I can get to know you and know who really likes the stories on this channel. Your presence here means everything. If this tale moved you, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to believe in love today. And if you are not yet subscribed, subscribe now and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another story. Thank you for being part of this journey. Until the next tale.